Thank you, Dave, for that tribute to your father and to fathers who have made a contribution into our lives. Some we don't even realize until maybe much time has passed, and we are reminded of what was modeled for us, what we were taught, and how we were loved. Today we're going to look at the book of Daniel, start looking at the book of Daniel. And I think this is an interesting book for us to look at. I remember my dad talking about the times he was, like some of you, he was part of the Depression time, hard times, and talked about how difficult it was for them as they tried to eke out a living and take care of my grandfather take care of his family and everybody pitching in and doing their part. And they would oftentimes during that era would be described as hard days, hard times. And now we jump forward to 2016 and we look at the times in which we live. Our economy is, for the most part, we're doing well in our country. We still live in a land of freedom, but also because of just the environment in which we live, the circumstances of world events where we find ourselves, we would say this could oftentimes be described as turbulent times, uncertainty of what each day will bring. And so I think this book of Daniel will help us learn how to live with courage during turbulent times. And we say, well, why study the book of Daniel? Well, one thing Bill Harper said, John, why don't you preach some out of the book of Daniel? That's not the only reason. I think it's time for us to take a look, especially this year in which we are living within our nation with election cycles taking place, uncertainty of what's going to happen as far as safety wherever we may be. I think the book of Daniel helps us answer some questions. For one thing, Daniel's situation parallels our own today as well, too. For most of his life, Daniel lived as part of a believing minority in a majority pagan culture. And from the time he was a teenager until he died at about the age of 90, he served under a series of pagan kings. And from his story, we will learn some useful principles as we try to live for Christ, filled with people who do not share our faith, in a world with people that do not share our faith. Secondly, I think we need to look at the book of Daniel because the reality is Daniel's prophecies may soon be fulfilled. This book is filled with dreams and visions and prophecies about the end times. And as we look at it, as we read through the book of Daniel, I encourage you to do that over the next several weeks. Read through it. You will be amazed at how the times of during the book of Daniel matches the end time. It mentions the times of where we are in the 21st century. And thirdly, we need to remember this. And this may be the most important lesson of the book. Daniel's God is our God, and He is still on His throne. God's in charge. He's in charge of the nations. He's in charge of the families. He's in charge of individuals. You need to remember, He is in charge of the past, the present, and the future. He's in charge of the good times and the bad days, of happiness and sorrow, of joy and of heartaches, of great victories and shocking defeats. And as we study this book, it ought to increase our confidence in the sovereignty of God who makes no mistakes. we will benefit from thinking about the courage of Daniel and his three friends. We may ask the questions as we look at our own turbulent times. How should we live in a world where believers are outnumbered and often overwhelmed by those who do not believe? Or maybe we ask from time to time, how should we respond to the outright hatreds of Christians and the rising tide of persecution all around the world? Where is God in the midst of a pagan culture? How do we proclaim Christ in a world that doesn't even believe in a concept of truth? Well, Daniel provides for us a very positive role model for how to live for God when no one else shares your faith. A little bit of background about Daniel. He lived 600 years before Christ. In the beginning of the book of Daniel, where we start today, he's a teenager. He's about 15 years old. And when the book closes, he's about 90 years old. He went from being an imported hostage to a trusted prime minister and counselor to some of the mightiest rulers of the world. And when the book opens, we find Daniel and his friends being forcibly taken from their homes in Jerusalem and deported to Babylon. And these were godly teens who are now going to undergo an enormous cultural transformation as they are being trained to work for a pagan king. We begin in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. And with some of the vessels of the house of God, he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. And they were to be educated for 3 years. At the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. 3 main players we see. There's Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. They would today represent the world system that's hostile to the people of God. Remember, as you read about Babylon in the Bible, Babylon is always, with no exception, a symbol for evil and anti-God paganism. Then there's Daniel. Daniel and his 3 friends. They represent the believers in the world, trying to obey God in the midst of spiritual opposition. Then the third player is the sovereign Lord. He leaves his children in the world, and yet he will bring them safely to glory in the end. He never speaks a word, yet he is the one behind the scenes orchestrating events to bring about his plan. So in the midst of these circumstances, we're going to see how 4 teenage boys who somehow found the courage to say no to temptation and to say yes to God. You remember the famous Charles Dickens line, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." And I want us to look at today because I think we learn something from this text of how the world tries to seduce the church. One thing, the world seeks to destroy our heritage. We read just moments ago, the book opens with a humiliating defeat. God's people were defeated by the Nebuchadnezzar's army. His army surrounded Jerusalem, overran the city's defenses, the temple, the city. All the things that mattered the most to the people fell in the hands of the enemy, of the pagans. This led, we saw, to deportation. So they were taken away. The city was left in ruins. The temple was destroyed. Daniel and his friends and others were sent to Babylon. They are far, far from home, separated from everything they've known. And they're beginning to wonder as they go into this foreign land 1,000 miles away, how will we worship God? We don't have a temple. We don't have the sacrifices. How are we going to worship God while living among unbelievers? In case you haven't noticed it, that's how the world sort of makes a frontal assault on the church today. Tries to diminish and reduce the heritage of our faith through all the years, separating us from our heritage, removing us from our past. Second thing, the way the world tries to seduce the church is simply tries to deconstruct our faith. We saw in verse 2 how Nebuchadnezzar took articles from the temple, things made out of silver and gold, and brought them back to Babylon with him. And then to make matters worse, he put them in his own temple, the temple of the chief god of Babylon called Baal or Marduk. And this was to show Israel they have been completely defeated. We have taken these things that you treasure the most, and now then they are in our possession. They no longer belong to you anymore. The message was clear. Our God is greater than your God. We win, you lose. But there's more than just this pagan boasting going on here. Because many years earlier, during a time of spiritual decline, if you remember, the Israelites, as they conquered other nations, brought the symbols of other gods into their temple. Now God allows a pagan king to take his treasures into a pagan temple. The Jews had desecrated their own temple. Now God allows the pagans to come in and do the same thing that the Jews had done before. So from a worldly point of view, it appeared God was dead. And when people begin to think that, they begin to ask the questions like, can I trust God when it seems like that He's dead, that He's not around, He doesn't care what's going on in my life? Do I still be faithful even when my world is falling apart? Is my God greater than the circumstances in which I'm living in my life? Now, we know the rest of the story, but all was not lost. But I'm going to tell you, at this point in time in the book of Daniel, it sure seemed that way to them, that it was over with. Third way that the world tries to seduce the church is tries to reconstruct our values. From verses 3 on, from this point on, everything else in the book of Daniel takes place in Babylon. From this point on, Daniel is away from his homeland. And as far as we know, he never returned, not even for a visit. And now then, Nebuchadnezzar begins his plan of Operation Assimilation. I've taken you out of your homeland. I've taken you away from your heritage. I'm changing the way you ought to speak and to believe. They chose the cream of the crop of the Jewish teenage boys. They were assigned to Ashpenaz, the king's right-hand man. And he's going to make sure they get the best education that Babylon can offer. For 3 years, they're going to be immersed in knowledge and culture and history and language and religion. And then they're promised at the end of those 3 years, as they go through all of this assimilation into this new culture, to this new place, they're going to enter into the king's service, and you will have a high-level government job. Does this sound like some of the stuff that's happening within our nation today? Trying to reconstruct our values, telling us those things that we have believed, that what we think and know the Bible it says to be true, they say those things do not apply to the 21st century anymore. Times have changed. People are different. By the way, one of the cornerstones of Marxism, of communism, was to reach into the young people. And they would say, mind control always begins with the young. So these guys, Nebuchadnezzar and them, had a plan. Full scholarship to the University of Babylon. Free food from the king's buffet. We see in verses 6 and 7, we're going to change your names. And so we would say today that these Jewish teenagers were on the fast track. They were on the fast track, and this looked like a sweet deal. It was a kind of break that most guys would jump at in a heartbeat. And to be fair, I don't know that if Nebuchadnezzar saw this as an evil thing, he probably saw it from his concept and his worldview that I'm doing these guys a favor. I'm going to make their life so much better than what it was back in Judah, so they forget about that and they buy into what we're doing here. There's a fourth way the world tries to seduce the church. It seeks to undermine our identity. We see that with the changing of the names. Now, it's not obvious from the English text, but all of these names had special meanings. The Hebrew names of Daniel, Hananiah, Michael, and Azariah all contain references to the God of Israel. And their new names, their Babylonian names, mention the gods of Babylon. Example, Daniel means God is my judge. Name changed to Belteshazzar means Bel, protect the king. Hananiah, Hebrew name meant the Lord is gracious. Changed to Shadrach means he was named after a sun god of the Babylonians. Michael, Hebrew name means who was like the Lord. And Meshach, his name is changed to who is what Aku, another Babylonian god, is. Azariah, Hebrew name is the Lord is my helper. Abednego means servant of Nebo. That was another Babylonian god. So clearly the goal was for these young men to think and act like pagans around them. And that might have worked except for one very important fact. You can change the outside, but you can't change the heart. Most of us know Romans 12:2. It says, do not be conformed to the world. If you ever read J.B. Phillips' translation, he renders it this way: don't let the world squeeze you into its mold. The world will squeeze us. We can't avoid that. But we don't have to give in to the pressure of the world. And here's one thing I want you to know today. All of these ways the world tries to seduce the church, we need to remember this. The world will not prevail against the church. In spite of what it may look like, in spite of what it may feel like. As we come to the end of our text, everything seems to be hopeless. Here you have these 4 teenagers ready to take on the mightiest man in the world. To us, it looks like they don't have a chance whatsoever. But we know that they survived with their faith intact, or there would not be a book of Daniel in the Bible today. And how did they do it? You see, they understood that 4 plus God equals a majority. And when you factor God into the equation, suddenly Nebuchadnezzar doesn't look so big. And when we as Christians begin to factor God into the equation instead of the politics, instead of all of the other stuff the world's throwing at us, then the world doesn't seem so big after all. There's a little phrase in verse 2 that I think we need to take a look at it. I sort of skipped over it. But in verse 2, it says, "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand." Some translation says, "The Lord delivered." Listen to this. What happened in Jerusalem was no accident. It did not catch God by surprise. The Babylonians was going to do that. Matter of fact, if there had been a newspaper back then, I think the headline would have read something like this: Nebuchadnezzar takes Jerusalem. Wrong. He didn't take Jerusalem. God gave it to him. And if God had not given to him, he would have never taken it at all. Church, Christians should be the calmest people on earth. We sit and wring our hands and get captivated by 24-hour news cycles. But we ought to be calm. We don't need to be wringing our hands, not when our God is on the throne working out his purpose on earth. The book of Daniel opens with what appears to be very clearly a triumph over good. Yet God allowed it for his higher purposes. And I'm sure Nebuchadnezzar didn't know that. And I'm sure the Jews had a lot of trouble believing that. But nonetheless, that was what took place. And as we think about this today, how did these 4 teenage boys find the strength to survive in a pagan land? The answer is found in the first part of verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. He resolved himself within his heart. And it all comes down to the heart in the end. Nebuchadnezzar could control the environment in which they lived, but he couldn't touch their hearts. Their bodies were in Babylon, but their hearts were in Jerusalem. You see, they never forgot who they were, whose they were, and where they came from. So it didn't matter where they happened to be, or even what names they happened to be called. Their faith was deep in their hearts, and the mightiest man in the world was helpless to do anything about it. Yea, God. Right? So how will we survive the continued onslaught of the world in our day. How do we do it? 2016, the same way they did. Putting our hearts in the right place. Now that means our bodies are here on earth, but our hearts must continually be in heaven. And if our hearts are in heaven, then it doesn't matter where we happen to be on earth, because the world can't touch us. Now, I know it's easy to be overwhelmed in these days when the world presses in on all sides of us. But we need to go back to remember the scripture. There was a night that Jesus spent in the Garden of Gethsemane in fervent prayer. It's recorded for us in John chapter 17. And in that prayer, Jesus says, "My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one." So don't be surprised that God will use the world to knock out all of our props so that we will turn back to Him. That's an important lesson in the book of Daniel. Israel was defeated, but God wasn't defeated. Remember, Jesus said in Matthew 16, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." This week I ran across a reading called The Fellowship of the Unashamed. I've had Virginia make copies of this, and I think they're available out on the table in the fellowship hall out here, and maybe out in the foyer as well too, just in case you want it. I've read this before, but this particular reading I found that some of the sources say this: it was written by an African pastor who was martyred for his faith. And I think it describes a kind of attitude that will help us overcome the world. It goes like this: I am part of the fellowship of the unashamed. I have Holy Spirit power. The die has been cast. I have stepped over the line. The decision has been made. I am a disciple of Jesus Christ. I won't look back. Let up, slow down, back away, or be still. My past is redeemed. My present makes sense. My future is secure. I am finished and done with low living, sight walking, small planning, smooth knees, colorless dreams, tame visions, worldly talking, cheap giving, and dwarfed goals. I no longer need preeminence, prosperity, promotions, plaudits, or popularity. I don't have to be right, first, tops, recognized, praised, regarded, or rewarded. For I now live by faith. I lean on His presence. I love by patience. I live by prayer and labor by power. My pace is set. My gait is fast. My goal is heaven. My road is narrow. My way is rough. My companions few. My guide is reliable. My mission is clear. I cannot be bought, compromised, detoured, lured away, turned back, deluded, or delayed. I will not flinch in the face of sacrifice, hesitate in the presence of adversity, negotiate at the table of the enemy, ponder at the pool of popularity, or meander in the maze of mediocrity. I won't give up. back up, let up, or shut up until I preached up, prayed up, paid up, stored up, and spoken up for the cause of Christ. I am a disciple of Jesus Christ. I must go until he returns, give until I drop, preach until all know, and work until he stops me. And when he comes to get his own, he will have no problem recognizing me. My colors will be clear. Who wants to join the fellowship of the unashamed? Who wants to join the fellowship of the unashamed? I think it was Jim Elliot, the martyred missionary, who said, when it comes time to die, make sure that's all you have to do. May God help us to live with our hearts in heaven, so that when he comes, we'll be easy to spot and ready to meet the Lord. The world's going to try to kill us. The world thinks they're winning. We're being defeated. But folks, our God is still God. He's still on the throne. And one day, we will taste victory, in spite of what looks like defeat today. So when the people come around and they have all of these things to say about what's wrong with Christians, what's wrong with the church, be polite and be kind and say, but you don't know my God. And one day, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. We're going to sing a hymn of invitation. It's hymn number 504. I think is a great song for us to close this service with, because it's the song Without Help. Now, we got a lot of people who are in charge of this world, in charge of this country, and this state, and this county, and they think that they are in charge and they are going to make sure everything works right. But I'm going to tell you, without him, there could be a lick of stuff done in this country. I don't know if that's good English or not, but that's good swamp Louisiana English. But you know what? We have a God that's reaching out to his people today and saying, don't be afraid. Don't wring your hands. I'm in charge. No matter who's elected president, we may not like any of them. That's probably most of us. But God is still in control. And this morning, they just say, hey, I want to be part of the fellowship of the unashamed. Some of you have already raised your hand. We invite you to come. Maybe you're not even a believer, but you're beginning to sense, you know what, this God stuff may be real. I need to do something about it because I want to be on the winning side at the end. Let me tell you, come join the team. We'll help you understand what it's like. We'll help you make those steps to become part of the winning team of those who are unashamed of the gospel. Maybe you're here today and it's time for you to kind of just rededicate your life. We invite you to come do that. You can do it right where you're sitting or standing. You can come pray at these steps. I know we need to leave, but let me just say this. There's something about taking some steps forward and standing in front of other people that kind of make this thing really real. Because I'm going to tell you, the enemy tries to seduce you and tell you, oh, you were just caught up in the emotion of the moment. We had some great music, some good songs. And John preached a message and had a reading at the end that really touched my heart. But that was just for the moment. There's something about taking some steps forward that you can look at the old devil right in the face and say, you're a liar. Because that day God gave you the courage to take a stand for him. Maybe you're looking for a church home. We're not perfect. We're on the way to trying to make a difference. We invite you to join our army of Green Valley Baptist Church.